In this video I will give you 13 tips so you can win from 4th position in Settlers of Catan. My name is Treeckosaurus and I'm a Catan Universe Grandmaster. So if you keep watching, you'll learn how to win from the position with the lowest win rate in Settlers of Catan. So let's get started. When I did my Catan placement study, I discovered 4th position has the lowest win rate of all 4 positions, which was no surprise to me. However, it was a surprise to me the win rate does not improve when the sand tile is in the 2nd ring. So to find out how to actually improve my win rate from 4th position, I've asked all my King of Catan opponents to start me from 4th position. And here's what I found. Tip number 1. Play with alternative strategies. When you're playing with expert players, the first few picks are strong or weak spots almost every single time. So a hybrid or weak cheap strategy often won't work from 4th position. But a longest road setup still works great. As well as the 5 resource strategy, the lockout strategy, the production strategy and the port strategy. The difficult part is recognizing when to use a certain strategy and when not to use a certain strategy. I'll go over all of them briefly later in this video. But first, tip number 2. Predict your opponent's placements. A big advantage you have when you're playing from 4th position is information. You already know your opponent's first placement, so you also know what resources they lack and what spots they're likely to place on with their 2nd settlement. First, you envision yourself picking a certain setup you think is good. Then you think of what 3rd position would do as a combination spot with his 1st settlement. When you do this, pay attention to the following mechanics. The first is what resources does his 1st spot have. Also, it's likely all of your opponents will go for Orvi cheap, road or 5 resource strategies. So what do they need to achieve that? The third mechanic is, what ports do they have with their 1st settlement? If they have one at all. Because expert players know without a port you're 2 points short. And the 4th thing to look at is, expect them to place on the highest producing spots possible. We'll go over making effective defensive placements later in this video. But for now, let's focus on tip number 3. Select rare resources. Because 4th position doesn't have much control over what spots you're left with, you have to recognize what opportunities you have to win. One of them is creating options by trading better than your opponents. And an effective way to create demand for your cards is to select rare resources. Because rare resources have more trade value than other resources. There are 3 metrics you need to keep an eye on to determine the rarest resource. The first is production per resource. The more a certain resource gets rolled, the lower its value. The second metric is the position of the hexes. If the hex is placed in the outer ring, it works with less 3 hex spots than a hex which is positioned in the 2nd ring or the center of the board. The third metric depends on the placements of the players. If there's a 6 sheep on the board, it's usually not so rare. However, if you expect nobody to place a settlement on that 6, for whatever reason, the production value of that 6 is 0. It's also true that if there's an 11 with 3 players on it, it has more production value than an 8 with only 1 player on it. With that being said, it's time to move on to tip number 4. Take on the tough task first. You want to stay under the radar by pacing your game in a way you don't get blocked and robbed a lot. You can do it by taking on the toughest task first. Let's look at an example. If player A has strong wood brick and no ore production, it's really tough to build a city. But it's exactly what I advise you to do right from the start. And if player B plays a strong Orvi cheap setup, it's tough to build road plus settlement. To win the game, you need to do it eventually, and in my opinion, it's best to not delay the task. A task I won't delay any further is to explain how alternative strategies work and what skills you need to execute them. Let's look at tip number 5. Play the longest road setup. First, you have to understand 4th position can't rely on the same strategy every single time. Mainly because each board is different and your opponents won't leave easy combinations for you on the table. The longest road setup needs a certain board to work effectively. Some conditions for the longest road setup are strong wood and brick spots, high production with your first 3 settlements, and preferably weak competition for the longest road and the possibility to connect your first 2 settlements. On top of that, you need some skills to make it work against the best players. The most difficult task is to build an early city, and to accomplish this task efficiently, you need to be able to make good trades and great steals. And for that, you need to be able to make basic calculations and have hand tracking skills. For every strategy, you need different skills and board conditions. As you can see with tip number 6, play the lockout setup. The lockout setup is a setup with settlement settlement placements done in a way they generate trade value for you on a specific resource. The strategy is to get the value from the trades because you're one of the few suppliers of this resource. For example, you can place your settlements in a way you're the only player with more than 3 points of wheat production. If that's the case, I can guarantee you others will ask for wheat during the game. In my opinion, it's not a strong strategy on itself, but it can make opponent setups a lot weaker as well. It cannot be played on every single board because you need to be able to at least lock some opponents out of a certain resource. You will have a bad balance in your resource gain, so you need to gain some of the other resources by trading, either with the other players or the bank. Bank trades are generally less efficient, so you need a lot of production as well. On top of that, you want to have negotiation and general trading skills. Fortunately, I've made a video with exactly these topics. In general, the rule is the less balance in your resource gain, the more trades you need to make it work. So with the lockout setup on the one end, we have the 5 resource setup on the other end of the spectrum. Which brings us to tip number 7. Use the most efficient strategy. If for some reason the other players left you the 5 resource setup, it can certainly work for you. However, it usually means the first 3 spots had a really high power level. So the skill to make defensive plays while taking 5 resources is key. Balance is also critical. And with that I mean the balance of your resources. For example, strong wood paired with strong brick or strong ore paired with strong wheat. And if there is a difficult balance, the setup requires a 3-for-1 port. Which brings us to tip number 8. Use port strategies. With port strategies, I'm referring to setups with high production on a certain resource and access to a complementary 2-for-1 port. Port strategies can also be combined with other setups like the longest road setup, the lockout strategy, and with hybrid or cheap as well, to make your position even stronger. For a port strategy to work, the board needs to provide high producing spots with an abundance of a specific resource. And of course, a 2-for-1 port. At the start of the game, you want to be active in trades because you probably lack a certain resource to build that settlement on the port. As you may have noticed by now, I love having the combination of high production and ports to cover up certain imbalances. And the next setup is no different. Tip number 9. Use the high production setup. The reason why I believe high production is so important is because often rolled numbers generate more cards by probability. Having more cards means having more options to make a good play, and making good plays consistently improves your odds of winning the game. The high production strategy always lacks a key resource like ore or wheat, but it relies on having a ton of cards each turn and utilizing a 3-for-1 port to gain the cards you lack. A big challenge for the high production setup is building a city. And like with the longest road setup, you want to take this task on as soon as possible. A big difference though is not being set up to take a win condition efficiently. If you can do it, great. But often you have to settle for winning without both road and army. Which brings us to tip number 10. Predict what win condition your opponent will go for. Like I said before, the advantage of 4th position is information. And it means that if you predict your opponent's settlements correctly, you can also predict what win condition their resource gain is suited for. For example, player C takes a strong or wheat spot with a little bit of wood. Now player C can go for a spot with strong brick and some extra wood production, so player C can battle for the longest road. But if that combination is not on the board, player C likely goes for a strong sheep spot to go along with the strong or wheat, to take the largest army. My advice is to go for the win condition with the least resistance, so you can get it more efficiently. By predicting what win conditions the other players will go for, you can figure out which win condition is up for the grabs. Let's move on to tip number 11. Point your road away from the races. One of the downsides of 4th position is the fact that you start rolling as the 4th player as well. The reason I find it such a problem is because your opponents have up to 3 turns to generate, steal or trade wood and brick cards before you can put a road down, which makes it super tough for you to win races against other players. It's also why I advise you to stay away from road races if possible when you're playing 4th position, because you're likely to get cut off. However, sometimes you're forced to try it because there are no other options to create a potentially winning setup. Which brings us to the key tip of this video, tip number 12. Use defensive plays. In Settlers of Catan, you can make offensive placements and defensive placements. Especially as 4th position, I find it to be really important to make defensive plays. The reason for it is that 4th position often has to play with the least powerful setup. But by making defensive plays, you can also make it so your opponents have less powerful setups as well. The difficult part about making defensive placements is trying to hurt your offensive game as little as possible. Let's move on to tip number 13. Practice board analysis. In Catan, you often have to make your plays within a certain time frame. It either being an actual timer in online Catan, for example, or your friends and family complaining about how long you take to place your settlements. And now, on top of your normal routine, I've given you more than 10 aspects to start paying attention to as well. So, how do I make my brain solve this puzzle as soon as possible? The answer is create board analysis systems. They are systems you can fall back on if your brain doesn't work as well as it can. My own board analysis system is like you can see on the screen. For me, it's really important to make sure I don't forget anything, while I adjust based on the decisions my opponents make. To win 70% of your games is very difficult, and in order to do so, you need to use a system and expand upon it. My system works for me as it simplifies the game for me. But your system can be pretty different. My goal is to play amazing on a consistent basis. And before we move on to a very special bonus tip, I have a question for you. What position works the best for you? It either being 1st, 2nd, 3rd or 4th position. And if you feel like it, why do you think it does? I'd love to hear from you so I can reply to your comment, which you can leave down below. And my very special bonus tip for you is utilize the narrative that 4th position is the worst. So how does that work? It's very simple. You don't want to get robbed, you don't want to get blocked, and you want to be able to make good trades with others. And your advantage as 4th position, especially in King of Catan, is having the ability to take on the narrative 4th position is the worst. Make sure to comment on the fact that you have the position with the lowest odds of winning of all 4 positions, because the other players are more likely to block players who are perceived to be the leader. On the screen you see all the tips I've given in this video. And again, I'd love to know what position you have the most success with in Catan. Thank you so much for watching this video. I reply to every single comment, so come at me. Shout out to all of my patrons who support my work in King of Catan and this channel. Also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss it when the next video drops.